distinguished participants in this conference, Excellencies, Ambassador Rajiv Chandar of India, distinguished academics and scholars, ladies and gentlemen. To start with, I must say that I was greatly touched by the very kind and welcoming remarks of Foreign Minister Zelenko, with whom I had the privilege of working together some 20 years ago in Ukraine. I must also apologize that I can't speak in Ukraine or Russian, but prefer to speak in English as several years have passed and my understanding or fluency of these languages is not there anymore. It's a great pleasure and honor to be in this beautiful city of Kiev and participate in the International Research and Practice Conference, Restructuring of the Global Space, Historical Imperatives and Challenges, which the Diplomatic Academy of Ukraine has organized. Earlier in the morning, we had perspectives or presentations which primarily focused on Europe. I would give a little different viewpoint, namely that of a country which is a little away from here and yet has been very much part of the same globalized process that Ukraine has been. Ladies and gentlemen, I was privileged to be here at the dawn of Ukraine's independence, when the wave of globalization had started to sweep across the world. Freedom of expression, openness in political and economic policy making, and a search for identity were the trends of this new development. The onset of globalization and the end of the Cold War marked a new era in Ukraine. In last 2 decades, Ukraine has recorded impressive socio-economic progress which is there for everyone to see. I can personally say so, since I was witness to the most difficult and trying circumstances that a newly independent country of Ukraine had to go through and endure. And yet, I saw that the spirit of the people was not suppressed. It was high and full of optimism. And I would therefore like to take this opportunity to express our appreciation to the governments and people of Ukraine over the past 20 years for their achievements in consolidating the newly won freedom and democracy. The impact of globalization in India was no less significant and sizable. India went through a series of economic reforms beginning in 1991, that is the time when globalization became the trend in the world, and sustained a high economic growth for past 20 years. Today, the Indian economy ranks as the 4th largest in the world and is expected to be the 2nd, only next to China, in about 2 decades. In the meanwhile, India continued to strengthen its institutions, especially democracy, and follow an independent foreign policy. Globalization, which lay emphasis on rapid communication through advances in technology, dissemination of information, and generally speaking, greater openness and transparency have been true game changers in today's world. India, on its part, welcomed these trends. Actually, globalization was not new to India. It has been an age-old Indian tradition to regard the whole earth as one family. There is a Sanskrit saying from ancient times which says, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam means the whole world is one family. With its increasing worldwide search and reach for information technology, India now believes that globalization has provided its people with new opportunities in trade and commerce, education, governance, and above all, in self-empowerment. And I believe that Ukraine has also been a beneficiary of the direction towards globalization with its well-known skills in agriculture, science and technology, engineering, etc., expanding all over the world. While it can be pointed out that globalization existed throughout historical times, with movement of peoples, traders, pilgrims, artists, and scholars across the continents and oceans, today it is a technology-driven mass movement in which civil societies are also increasingly involved. In fact, internet and media have enabled people across the world to develop a common consciousness. Empathy for freedom, human rights, or equality are shared by people everywhere, regardless of race, religion, or color. As a result of globalization, geography is thus being condensed, and we are becoming inseparable parts of one world. From outer space, our earth looks small, but one. Can today's digitized world be compartmentalized? We have seen over the years that war and peace are indivisible, and that lesson is more pertinent today, even as we deal with the dilemma of dealing with traditional security issues on the one hand and demands of globalization on the other, which call for a global debate and global solutions on issues such as the global financial crisis, environmental degradation and climate change, world trade, international terrorism and religious fundamentalism, piracy, etc., which have become transnational in nature. A question therefore arises whether geopolitics can or should come in the way of the inexorable movement towards globalization. And it is on this background that the international discourse today seeks to find a new paradigm to deal with the existing world order, which is based on the Westphalian nation-state concept and the new, perhaps not quite new, but which have come up in sharp focus, the forces of globalization, which are challenging the prevalent basis and even value system. It is this new paradigm or restructuring of the global space which this conference is significantly devoting itself, and I must congratulate you, the organizers, for this, to explore while calling for an objective assessment or a reassessment of the world situation, taking into account the existing realities and new challenges, calling for reforms or for setting another architecture. And it is about such a new architecture in a post-Westphalian world, hypothetical it may sound today, that India could offer its experience of living and prospering in its extraordinary diversity of religions, races, languages, subcultures, etc. A population of 1.2 billion with its enormous diversity can therefore present a useful experience to a number of countries in the world, because without diversity you cannot have any post-Phalian concept of a globalized world. I think we'll have to accept. It is often, what is often talked about as the idea of India, it encompasses the fact of multiplicity. The new global space has to be tolerant and accommodating of each other. If it is based on mainly considerations of nationalism, it may create differences with others. For the sake of harmony and amity in the restructured space, the principle of peaceful coexistence is, in my view, a sine qua non. It is interesting to see that along with nationalism, there is also today craving for regionalism. In each part of the world, regional groupings have come up seeking greater cohesiveness and cooperation. In Europe, it is the European Union. In Southeast Asia, it is ASEAN. In Africa, it is the African Union. In South Asia, SAARC, and so on. It can be argued that in such arrangement, a country is theoretically willing to concede an element of its sovereignty. It is seen these days that a country is still comfortable with overlapping identities. In fact, multiple identities has become a common and accepted norm, with countries wishing to be members of as many regional bodies or free trade arrangements as possible. To give a few examples, BRICS is a grouping of countries from Latin America, Asia, and Africa. There are intercontinental arrangements such as the East Asia Summit, where countries from Southeast Asia are members, along with that from Northeast Asia, India, Australia, the US, and Russia. The European Union has several observer states from other regions. Today, regionalism is a preferred mode for broad policy coordination and cooperation. It is not the outcome of any attractive economic offers and possibilities alone. It also emerges from the desire of countries from a particular region, or in some cases even across the continents, to come together to address issues of common concern. Among the global institutions that we all have, and we are actually quite generally happy, is the United Nations. It was the vision of the founding fathers of the UN that they conceived a world body long before the word globalization came into parlance. The international system that stands to benefit a great deal from this instrumentality of the United Nations, be it for international peace and security, disarmament, human rights, economic and social development, development programs, etc. The UN and organizations such as the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank are such where the need for restructuring is acutely felt. These institutions, which were set up soon after the end of the Second World War, do not anymore reflect the realities of the present day world, especially the United Nations Security Council. If it were to play an effective role with regard to global issues of security and peace, and therefore it requires urgent reforms. India, working along with Japan, Germany, and Brazil, has long called for a permanent seat in the UN Security Council, stating that India has a legitimate claim given the size of its population, its economic status, and its enormous and continuing contribution to UN peacekeeping. The number of issues which I mentioned have a global reach, and they have a global impact that goes far beyond the boundaries of an individual country. And yet, the approach to examining and finding solutions to them has remained largely in the domain of geopolitics. For example, the global financial crisis, which was triggered by a domestic subprime crisis in the US since 2008, has cast a shadow on Europe with deep consequences around the world. Solution to this crisis has to come from several countries and private institutions, but it is not possible Still, the national laws of number of countries will govern kind of economies these countries have. Any delay in addressing the questions of poverty, non-inclusiveness, large-scale unemployment, vast and unacceptable income disparity, or consequences of reckless urbanization will wreak disaster not only in the developing countries but also the developed Western world. What happened last year in the Occupy Wall Street movement in New York and what is currently happening on the streets of Greece, Spain, Portugal, or even Italy should be a constant reminder to the international community. Globalization has undoubtedly several advantages, but it cannot be allowed to be circumscribed by geopolitics, or globalization should also not be permitted to create disparities and divisions in a society. Environment and climate change are again such areas where principles of equity, common and differential responsibility have to be accepted by all countries, since the consequences of climate change recognize no national boundaries. And yet, at Copenhagen or Durban, there was deadlock over the question of responsibility by developed states. Geopolitics on the issues of environment or climate change will seriously impede progress on these critical questions which will impact on security and well-being of the entire mankind. Human security under the ambit of non-traditional security issues is a new element which has entered international discourse, which has again transnational dimension. Movement of persons across state boundaries is a clear manifestation of globalization. However, while globalization of information or capital and investments is welcomed, more and more stringent restrictions on immigration are being placed or visa rules are being tightened, especially with respect of persons from developing countries. Another case of globalization and geopolitics you can see in contradiction. Human rights will assume greater consciousness of global community with demands for better and transparent governance and democratic justice rising across the world. Globalization can play a greater role in this regard. The Arab Spring is a clear expression of the irresistible urge of the common people who have remained suppressed for decades. This was an epoch-making development of similar dimension as the end of the Cold War and emergence of independent states of the CIS. In the Arab Spring, we find that fearless opposition to authoritarianism or totalitarianism is continuing to find voice in the world. Terrorism, which has changed the face of earth since 9/11, is a horrendous scourge which also cuts across state boundaries. We have all been hapless victims of terrorism and religious fundamentalism. India has continued to face cross-border terrorism on a large scale from much before 9/11. One of the recent developments on the international landscape is the steady emergence of multipolarity. The unipolar world in the aftermath of the end of the Cold War has changed a great deal in a short period. In each region or sub-region, there are powers today which are increasingly more assertive about their place and demands. This may complicate the geopolitical scene, but on the other hand, can lead to greater democratization among the community of nations. And this could permit a more open and equitable treatment of global issues of common concern. Development of regionalism can be considered as a positive development in the direction of shared thinking and responsibility towards a particular issue. Groupings of countries based on specific issues also serve useful purposes in this regard. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to speak very briefly about India-Ukraine relationship, how it has evolved on solid foundations to a substantial and cooperative partnership in a short span of time. And I think it has a linkage to today's theme because stronger bilateral relationships and understanding also can lead to a better restructuring of the global space. India was one of the first countries to recognize an independent state of Ukraine and invited President Kravchuk for a state visit to India within a couple of months of Ukraine's independence. Next year, India's President Dr. S.D. Sharma paid a state visit to Ukraine and was warmly received here. I remember it was in the area of defense and science and technology that we had excellent cooperation. The famous Ukrainian scientist Dr. Boris Paton took a delegation of leading scientists to India, and I had accompanied Dr. Paton, who met Dr. Abdul Kalam, our well-known scientist who later on became India's president. It was in the area of culture and education that our relations have been strong. I remember in those days the deep interest in Indology, Sanskrit and Hindi languages, Indian dances and music, and our Bollywood films, the Diwali functions, the works of Mahatma Gandhi, Rabindranath Tagore and Nehru that brought the Ukrainian people close to us. And I'll always recall with much gratitude the Ukrainian government's gesture in fulfilling their commitment to a very large number of Indian students, hundreds of them, to complete their studies without any additional fees. Several of these students have made Ukraine their home, and I'm happy to see they are doing very well and are contributing to Ukraine's progress and prosperity. I recall the Joint Commission at the ministerial level was set up in 1994 in Delhi, for which Honorable Foreign Minister Mr. Zelenko had traveled there. And I'm now told that it is going to be held in Kiev very shortly. New areas of defense equipment exchanges are being explored. Bilateral trade between India and Ukraine has grown from a mere $190 million in 1992 to $3 billion as of this year. Investments in pharmaceuticals, steel, metallurgy, petrochemicals, IT, etc. are taking place on both sides. India and Ukraine appear to be set on the path of robust cooperation. For two large democracies in South Asia and Central Europe, this is a very positive development. In today's times of globalization, this should augur very well for our respective regions and beyond. The values of humanism and internationalism, which the great artists, poet, philosophers of Ukraine, namely Taras Shevchenko and Rabindranath Tagore of India, worked and lived, are the beacons for us in our common search for a peaceful and enlightened world where the winds of knowledge and compassion from all parts of the world will be welcomed and absorbed for the common benefit of all. Thank you.